Okay, so the question that I'm going to be responding to today is question number one, which is many low-lying cities like New Orleans are at risk of frequent flooding and storm surges due to subsidence, stronger storms, and sea level rise due to warmer temperatures. When, if ever, should New Orleans be permanently evacuated? So I'm going to walk through some of the main arguments that there are about what the environmental impacts are on a city like New Orleans. And then I'm going to go into my opinion and I'm going to talk about why it's worth discussing this at all. I'm going to talk about an alternative position to what I'm saying, and then I'm going to refute that opinion to conclude everything. So, first things first, I want to talk about levees, which are present in New Orleans to try and keep the city from not flooding in times of tropical storms. And for the most part, it's kept the city safe in the wake of warm weather storms such as hurricanes. There's two major levees that hold back the Mississippi River from flooding New Orleans, and collectively the levee system makes up about 200 miles worth of walls. There's also an additional 100 miles of flood walls that are kind of a second level of precaution to a tropical storm. Now, these walls are all that pretty much stands between the city of New Orleans and vulnerability, and we saw in 2005 during Hurricane Katrina that when the levees break, the city can become dangerously flooded, and many people can lose their lives, many people can lose their homes, and we are still not fully recovered from the damages to certain people in certain communities in New Orleans. So in his article reflecting um, you know the neglecting future urban development, Tom Logan from University of Michigan argues essentially that the levies and other measures that we're taking to try and fix the problem actually are going to make temporary solutions and are not going to fix the problem long term. He says that if you build more levees, those levees are going to break, and actually he suggests that sometimes it's actually going to make the problems worse long term. And he also concludes by saying that the only thing that really we can do to fully solve the problem is to move. So I think that that's a very real argument. I think that's a very good point to be making. And Katrina is just one example of how if the levees were not in place, the flooding may not have been as bad, and perhaps less lives could have been lost. That's not to say that in the short term it actually could cause more flooding, but some may argue that the cost benefit of the short term versus the long term actually saves lives, protects homes, protects livelihoods. Another example that you can't help but think about is the example of the Japanese tsunamis and the way that the mayors on the coastal cities responded to that when it was found that the northwest Pacific region of the United States had um, those earthquakes that occurred in 1700, resulting in tsunamis in Japan. So the way that the mayors dealt with it there is that they basically rebuilt infrastructure in the city to cause the rising sea levels and threats to coastal cities to decrease, which could be effective, but it's also kind of looking short term and not long term for when the sea level continues to rise and more tsunamis threaten the region. So, in my opinion, there's really two ways to look at this problem. You can either evacuate the cities now before the storms get worse and before they crush the lives forever and the livelihoods forever, or you can wait until it gets unbearable and that would be the time that you move. But the risk that you run with that is maybe a storm comes in a short period of time and it kills a lot of people, it ruins a lot of lives, and that could be something that happens more in the next couple years instead of the forecasted, several decades. So, because of the increasingly high risks, because of the fact that the temporary solutions sometimes only make the whole thing worse, I would argue that the former is correct and that people should evacuate as soon as possible to protect their own interests, their own livelihoods. It may seem like an economic burden to a lot of these families to have to move now, but it's nothing compared to what would happen if they had to wait until a disaster struck and ruined everything that they already had. Because those people, you can ask the people who survived Hurricane Katrina, especially those of lower income houses and in regions that are more heavily affected by the flooding, those people are still recovering. And if we don't act soon, then there could be a lot more people like that. So why is this worth discussing? So actual lives and livelihoods are at risk. This is not a theoretical. And if people don't act now, then there's a very real possibility that a lot of people are going to lose everything. It's also very unevenly, as I kind of touched upon prior, it's very unevenly going to impact lower income communities, as a lot of the regions that will become more affected in times of hurricane are poorer communities or geographical regions that are more likely to be affected. Those have people who don't make as much income, and those are also the people that are going to struggle to recover more in this whole position. So that's why it's important that we address this, because it could turn into an economic crisis in addition to an environmental crisis. And we want to protect as many lives as possible and as many livelihoods as possible. Now, an alternate position to what I would say is that we should not have these people move urgently. And this would be feasible if we found ways to create better infrastructure to protect against more long-term problems and tropical storms and so on and so forth. So if, for example, we were able to do what Japan does and raise the sea level, build better infrastructure to protect against hurricanes, then there's an argument to be made that the city of New Orleans could be salvaged. However, the reason I would refute that is because I think it's a big if, and you could be putting a lot more lives at risk if this infrastructure does not work out the way you think. And I don't think it's worth it to, hinge the future of New Orleans and the future of those people all on an if.